The room was full of laughter and clinking silverware, the kind of noise that's supposed to feel warm on Thanksgiving. But I could hear every word Rachel said, each one sharpened just enough to cut without leaving a mark you could point to. My name is Claire, and I've learned to survive her little performances, the casual jabs disguised as family banter. I was ready to take another one on the chin until I noticed Lily watching me from across the table, her gaze steady and unblinking as if she was weighing every word, every gesture. The moment her lips parted, the air shifted, the laughter died, and every face turned toward the smallest person in the room. Because somehow they all knew what was coming next would change everything. The moment I stepped through Rachel and Daniel's front door in Charlotte, I could feel the heat of her eyes sweeping over me. It was the same calculated look she had worn so many times before, the one that seemed to search for flaws to pick apart later. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls hung in the air, but it did nothing to soften the tension that clung to the walls. The living room was full of voices, clinking glasses, and the rustle of holiday outfits. Daniel's family had arrived early and taken their usual spots near the fireplace, his mother in a sharp navy dress, his brother and sister-in-law chatting in low voices while keeping an eye on everyone who came in. My parents were seated near the window, already settled, and my father stiff in his chair, my mother trying to smile. Rachel came toward me with a smile that never reached her eyes. She kissed my cheek lightly and stepped back, glancing at my dress, as if she were appraising it for resale value. Her voice was sweet and airy when she welcomed me in, but underneath it there was a sharpness I had learned to recognize. Dinner was already set out in the dining room, the long table covered in a cream linen cloth, polished silverware, and dishes lined up like soldiers. I took my seat at the far end next to Lily, who was already nibbling at a bread roll. She gave me a quick smile before focusing on her plate, her small hands folded carefully in her lap. As the turkey was carved and plates passed around, the chatter was easy at first, holiday pleasantries about traffic and weather, comments on the cranberry sauce. I kept my eyes on my food, listening more than speaking. It didn't take long for Rachel to make her move. It started with a light laugh from her end of the table. She was telling Daniel's sister a story about how she had been helping me with some paperwork for my job, then she turned the focus to me, her tone casual but her words precise. She said she worried I might be in over my head, that managing my position at the construction company must be a real challenge since I never seemed to have much luck holding on to work for long. A couple of people chuckled softly. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I felt the familiar rush of heat in my chest, the urge to defend myself pressing hard against my ribs. I stayed still, forcing my hand to lower the fork without trembling. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking as he added that, at least I had family to look out for me. His eyes met mine briefly, holding them for a fraction too long before he turned back to his wine glass. The message was clear enough. Around us, conversation slowed, the subtle shift in energy settling into the table like a thin layer of frost. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked down at her plate, choosing silence. I told myself to let it pass, to not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I could feel Lily watching. Her gaze was steady, not the curious glance of a child, but something sharper, older. She took a breath, set down her fork, and in a voice that was calm and almost too even, she said, "Mom, you shouldn't say that." The room went still. Rachel's head turned slowly toward her daughter. "And why not, sweetheart?" Lily kept her eyes on her mother. "Because everyone here is going to know the truth soon." No one spoke. Even the sound of silverware against plates had stopped. Daniel's mother looked from Lily to Rachel, confusion etched across her face. Kevin Ross, Daniel's cousin, cleared his throat but said nothing. Rachel let out a small laugh, the kind she used when she thought someone was being silly, but I could see the quick flash in her eyes. She reached for her water glass, her hand just a little too quick, the rim of the glass clinking against her plate as she set it down. Lily picked up her roll again, as if she hadn't just shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. I felt the pulse in my neck slow, a strange mixture of dread and curiosity taking root. I didn't know what she meant exactly, but I had a feeling we were all about to find out soon enough. I reached for my napkin, smoothing it across my lap, and kept my eyes on the table. The room had changed, the easy holiday hum replaced by a quiet that felt like the pause before a storm. I kept my hands still on my lap, willing the moment to pass, but my mind had already slipped back to a time when things between Rachel and me were not like this at all. We grew up in Greenville, two sisters who shared a small bedroom with faded pink wallpaper and whispered secrets under the covers. Back then, she used to follow me everywhere, tugging on my sleeve when she was scared, looking to me to explain the world. I protected her in the way big sisters do, standing up to the girls at school who made fun of her, teaching her how to braid her hair the summer before middle school. It all shifted the year she met Daniel. He was charming in the way that makes people lean in, always dressed sharp, always with a story about some property deal that sounded too good to be true. I remember meeting him for the first time at a backyard cookout, watching the way Rachel's eyes followed him, bright and a little dazzled. At first, I thought maybe he was good for her. She seemed so certain, and I wanted to believe her. After the wedding, things changed in ways I could not quite name at first. Calls from Rachel grew less frequent. Invitations to visit became rare. When I did see her, there was a new edge to her voice, a way of speaking to me as if I were someone she had outgrown. By the time Lily was born, I was already being kept at arm's length. She would text me photos of the baby, but always find a reason I could not come by. Too busy, not a good day, Lily's napping. I told myself she was just adjusting to motherhood. The truth became harder to ignore when I noticed she no longer mentioned me to Lily at all. The first time I saw my niece after months apart, Lily looked at me with polite confusion, as if trying to place me. It cut deeper than I could explain. Around that time, our parents began talking about putting their affairs in order. They had a modest property in Greenville, a house with a small orchard out back, and some savings they wanted split evenly between us. It was meant to be simple, no drama, no reason for hurt feelings. One afternoon, Mom called me, her voice unusually careful. She said she and Dad had been thinking, and since I had supposedly already received a significant sum from them years ago, they felt it was only fair that Rachel get a larger share now. I was so stunned I almost dropped the phone. I had never received such a thing, not a check, not a gift beyond birthdays and Christmas. When I asked where that idea had come from, Mom hesitated before saying Rachel mentioned it. My pulse thudded in my ears. I could picture her sitting in their kitchen, speaking in that soft, convincing tone she used when she wanted something. Planting the lie without ever having to prove it. I drove to their house that weekend, determined to set the record straight. Rachel's SUV was already in the driveway. When I stepped inside, she was at the table with Dad, sipping coffee like she owned the place. She smiled at me, all politeness, and asked if I wanted a cup. I asked her in front of them if she had told them I got some kind of payout before. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes flickered just enough for me to see it. She said she had heard me mention once years ago that I got help from them for rent when I was between jobs. She must have misunderstood, she said, and thought it was a much larger amount. It was a lie so neat it almost sounded reasonable. Except I had never said any such thing. I told her so, my voice tight, but she only shrugged and turned back to her coffee. Dad cleared his throat, uncomfortable, but no one corrected the record. Driving home, I realized what she had done. With one story, she had shifted my parents' view of me, painted me as someone who had already taken more than my share. It was not about the money, not really. It was about her being willing to twist the truth just enough to push me out of the picture. After that, I noticed other small things. Invitations to family events sent late or not at all. Mutual friends suddenly cool toward me as if they knew something I did not. Every time I tried to bridge the gap, she found a way to close the door again. It became clear this was not about a misunderstanding. It was about Rachel building a version of events where I was less deserving, less trusted, less welcome. Sitting there at her dining table now with her guests and her husband watching, I could still feel the weight of that first betrayal. It was the beginning of a pattern that had only grown sharper over the years. And as much as I wanted to pretend her words tonight meant nothing, I knew better. I picked up my glass of water, more for something to do with my hands than out of thirst, and took a slow sip. The noise around the table began to pick up again, but that undercurrent of tension remained humming just beneath the surface. Somewhere down the table, Lily was speaking softly to Olivia Ross, her small face composed, her eyes still carrying that same steady focus from before. I told myself to keep my expression neutral to get through the rest of the evening without adding more fuel to whatever Rachel had planned. But in the pit of my stomach, the familiar ache of knowing just how far my sister would go to get what she wanted had already settled in. Daniel had always been a man who filled the space he was in not just with his height or the way he carried himself, but with an energy that demanded attention. On paper, he was a success story in Charlotte's booming real estate market, the kind of man people shook hands with at fundraisers and remembered. In reality, he was a man who could take the air out of a room with a single look. I had seen him lose his temper enough times to know the signs. The tight set of his jaw, the slight tilt of his head when someone said something he didn't like, the measured pause before his words came out sharp. Rachel always brushed it off, telling anyone who noticed that he was just under a lot of stress at work. She said it with a smile, as if repeating it often enough would make it true. One Sunday afternoon a few months back, I had dropped by their house to bring Lily a book she wanted for school. Rachel was in the kitchen, her voice low but tense, and Daniel's deeper voice cut through hers. He was standing near the counter, shoulders rigid, listing all the ways she had ruined his week. She kept nodding, smoothing her hair, murmuring that she would do better. When he noticed me, he switched to a bright, almost exaggerated welcome, as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. It was like that often. The moment there was an audience, he could flip the switch. But when it was just family, the mask would slip. I remember once at a barbecue, he criticized the way Rachel had arranged the table. His tone clipped, his words more like commands than suggestions. She laughed it off, saying she forgot he was such a perfectionist. The first time I ever stepped into it, I didn't think. It was a small gathering at their place, just a few friends and family, and Daniel made a comment about me not understanding how hard real estate work was because I had a safe little office job. I told him my work wasn't exactly easy either, that managing projects meant dealing with deadlines, budgets, and crews who didn't always cooperate. His eyes narrowed in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. He stood up slowly, walked over until he was standing much too close, and looked down at me. His voice was low, but it had that dangerous edge. He said some people should know when to keep quiet in someone else's home. It wasn't loud enough for everyone to hear, but I felt the intent in every syllable. I stepped back before I realized I had moved my heel, brushing against the leg of the chair. Rachel was there in a second, sliding herself between us with a tight smile, telling him to check on the grill. He went without another word, but not before giving me one last look over her shoulder. Later that evening, I was helping clear the table when I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Lily in the doorway holding a stack of napkins. She wasn't looking at the dishes or at me, but at the patio where her father stood, beer in hand, talking to one of his friends. Her face was unreadable, her small brow furrowed just enough to show she had noticed something. "You all right, kiddo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She nodded, setting the napkins down. Her eyes flicked back toward Daniel, then to me. She didn't ask questions, but she didn't need to. I could tell she was storing it away somewhere, the way children do when they don't understand everything but know enough to remember. Another time a similar moment unfolded. Rachel had spilled a bit of wine on the new rug in the living room during a dinner party. Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice dropping low as he told her she should be more careful with things that cost real money. She tried to laugh, dabbing at the stain, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes. When she walked into the kitchen, I followed, offering to help. She brushed me off, saying it wasn't a big deal, that I didn't know how particular he could be about the house. It was never a big deal until it was, and I knew the line could be crossed in an instant. I had seen it in the way he leaned over Rachel, in the way she shrank just slightly when his voice sharpened. That night, as I drove home, I thought about how Daniel's control over Rachel wasn't always in the obvious moments. It was in the small things, the constant corrections, the disapproving glances, the way she anticipated his reactions before he spoke. It was in how she had learned to manage him so no one else had to see. And it was in the way Lily watched, her eyes missing nothing. Rachel's dining room faded to a soft blur around the edges as conversation started up again, but my focus kept drifting to the quiet child at the far side of the table. After dessert, I offered to help with dishes and slipped into the kitchen. Lily patted in a minute later, small steps, careful hands folded, as if she understood that sound carried further in a tense house. She stood on her toes to reach the faucet and rinsed off spoons one by one. I told her I had a new book she might like about a girl who designs bridges for a science fair. Her eyes brightened and she asked what my job was really like. I told her I worked with clients who wanted to change their homes and that I spent a lot of time listening, taking notes, and making sure the crews had what they needed. She asked if people were ever unkind when they did not get what they wanted. I said sometimes they were and sometimes they raised their voices, but that the job was mostly about calming rooms down. She nodded like she was measuring that answer against something she already knew. Then she asked if stress could make people forget how to be gentle. I said it could, and that grown-ups were supposed to fix that, not the kids around them. The kitchen door swung, and Rachel breezed in with a stack of plates and a bright voice that felt slightly too bright, and the moment folded itself up and stored somewhere behind Lily's eyes. A few days later, I stopped by their house on a Tuesday afternoon with a tin of oatmeal cookies still warm. Rachel had texted that she would be late from an appointment. Lily let me in, her hair pulled back with a ribbon that kept sliding loose. We sat at the table. She poured milk and pushed the tin toward me, then asked another round of questions about work. She wanted to know if I ever felt nervous talking to clients who were upset. I told her I did at first, but it helped to lay out the plan step by step and to have another adult in the room when a conversation felt heavy. At school today, she said after a pause, a lady came to our class. Her name is Mrs. Sarah Thompson. She works with families. She told us if we see things that do not feel right, we can tell a trusted adult. She said we should not keep feelings in a locked box. She said grown-ups are supposed to help keep homes safe. I asked if she liked Mrs. Thompson. Lily said she did. She said Mrs. Thompson was calm and did not talk in a rush, and that she answered every question, even the ones that were quiet. Then Lily looked straight at me and said she knew how to protect people. She did not explain how. She just set her little palm flat on the cookie tin as if sealing her words there. Before I could ask more, the garage door rumbled and Rachel's voice floated in. Lily's shoulders tightened then loosened. She stood, put the lid back on the tin, and went to greet her mom. When Rachel came into the kitchen, she was full of traffic and parking and a client who had changed their mind 3 times about a skincare package at the spa. She asked if I could stay for dinner. I said I had an early site meeting, thanked her, and kissed Lily's forehead before I left. The next time I saw Lily, it was a Saturday at Freedom Park. Daniel had taken a call and wandered toward the pond while Rachel arranged a blanket near a live oak. Lily sat beside me and drew shapes in the dirt with a twig. She asked what it was like when Rachel and I were little. I told her we fought over hairbrushes and shared lip gloss and hid birthday gifts in the closet, and that we used to camp in the backyard and pretend the porch light was a moon. Lily smiled at that picture, then asked when things changed. I told her sometimes people grow in different directions and they forget what used to matter most, but families can still find their way back if everyone tries. She watched the pond while I spoke, the line of her mouth tight with thought. When Daniel returned, he was all easy charm, telling Lily to race him to the swings. He lifted her onto the seat and pushed just a little too hard. Lily gripped the chains and leaned forward, steadying herself with more control than most children her age. She did not complain. She simply adjusted and watched him through the arc as if memorizing the measure of his force. Later that afternoon, I dropped Lily at a friend's birthday party and offered to pick her up so Rachel could finish at the spa. When I came back 2 hours later, the party had spilled onto the lawn. Lily stood slightly apart from the group, talking to the birthday girl's dad. He handed her a paper bag with leftover cupcakes and thanked me for helping with cleanup. Lily walked to the car holding the bag with both hands like a fragile package. Halfway home, she asked if promises are like fences. I asked what she meant. She said promises keep people in safe places and sometimes they keep danger out. She let that thought sit between us like a folded map and changed the subject to the book I had given her about bridges. The school called my mother the following week to invite family to a class presentation day. I could not get away from a site walkthrough in South End that morning, but I drove straight to Willow Creek Elementary afterward and arrived in time for the last few presentations. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers and pencil shavings, and there were posters about kindness on the walls. Lily's group had mapped out community helpers. Her index card said families, teachers, neighbors, and one more word added in smaller handwriting at the bottom that said truth. During questions, one boy asked who you tell if the helper is the one who needs help. Lily said you tell another helper, and you keep telling until someone listens. Her voice was even and steady. Mrs. Thompson stood near the back and gave a small nod. After the bell, Lily walked out with her backpack slung over one shoulder. I asked if she wanted to grab hot chocolate before Rachel picked her up. We sat at a corner table of a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and steam. Lily wrapped both hands around the paper cup and let the heat soak in. She asked if sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is say a hard truth. I said yes, even when it shakes the room. I asked if she wanted to tell me something hard. She said not yet, but soon. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook. On the first page, she had written questions for brave people. The first question was, what does safe feel like? The second was, how do you know who will help? She closed the notebook before I could read more. When Rachel arrived, her smile was a little tight, like it had been pulled on quickly. She thanked me and said she was late to meet a vendor. Lily stood and tucked her chair in with careful precision. On the walk to the car, she slipped her hand into mine and squeezed once, then let go. It felt like a signal. That evening, I stopped by my parents' house in Greenville. Mom was making chicken soup, and Dad had a football game on low in the living room. We talked about the class presentation and about how grown-up Lily seemed lately. Dad said she reminded him of Rachel at that age, observing and quiet, soaking up details. I did not say what I was thinking, that Lily had the same bright mind but a different gaze, one that searched not for attention but for patterns. Sunday dinner at Rachel and Daniel's came around again. I brought a salad and a pie. The house looked perfect, glossy floors, scented candles, a new framed print on the wall. Dinner began with small talk about a new development Daniel was pitching near Lake Norman. He spoke in that confident role he used for clients. Rachel nodded and offered details as if she were part of the deal, and maybe she was. Halfway through the meal, she turned a casual remark about my project timeline into a joke that I was slow and careful to a fault. A few people laughed. Daniel smirked. I felt the familiar rise in my chest and let it fall away. From my end of the table, I could see Lily's face in profile. She was listening without moving. When Rachel reached for the salt, Lily shifted her plate a fraction of an inch to make room, her eyes never leaving her mother. When Daniel made a sharp comment about the way Rachel had plated the vegetables, Lily's gaze flicked to his hands and back to his face in a quick assessment that seemed beyond her years. She did not flinch. She simply recorded the shape of the moment in her stillness. After dinner, I helped clear dishes again. Lily carried the gravy boat with both hands, feet placed carefully like a dancer. In the kitchen, she set the dish down and looked up at me. She asked if bridges ever fail because of one small crack. I said they can if the crack is ignored long enough. She asked how you fix a bridge like that. I said you examine it closely, you tell the right people, and you repair it piece by piece before anyone gets hurt. She looked relieved, not because of the answer itself, but because she had a language to attach to a worry. On my way out, I found Rachel alone in the foyer adjusting a vase of hydrangeas. She glanced at the door and asked if I could try to be more positive in front of Daniel's family, that it made things easier. I told her I had not said anything unkind. She shrugged and said, "Sometimes silence speaks the loudest." Her perfume was sharp and floral. I stepped back to breathe easier. Outside, the air was cool and carried the scent of fallen leaves. I stood on the porch for a minute and listened to the soft murmur of voices inside. Through the window, I could see Lily in the living room picking up napkins from the coffee table one by one and stacking them into a neat square. She paused, looked toward the hallway where Daniel and Rachel had disappeared, then turned her head slightly as if training her ears to catch small sounds from far away. Driving home, I thought of Mrs. Thompson's words as Lily had repeated them. Trusted adult tell what does not feel right, keep telling. I did not know exactly what Lily planned or whether she planned anything at all, but I knew this much. She was paying closer attention than any of us. She was looking for the crack in the bridge, and she was not going to pretend it was not there. The next morning before my first meeting, I opened my email and found a message from the school about a family resource night the following week. The subject line mentioned safety support and community. I clicked Add to Calendar and stared at the entry a long time. Then I closed my laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet, letting the weight and possibility of those 3 words settle into place. It started with a phone call from my mother just after lunch, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when she was about to say something unpleasant but wanted to dress it in concern. She asked if everything was all right at my job in the design firm. I told her it was that I had just finished a kitchen remodel downtown and was starting a project in Myers Park. She hesitated, then said she had heard from Aunt Marlene that someone mentioned I'd been warned by my boss for missing deadlines. I felt my stomach tighten. I knew immediately where that rumor had come from. Rachel had always understood how to plant a seed so it grew in the direction she wanted. The idea that I was unreliable at work was exactly the sort of thing that could stick in the minds of extended family, especially if delivered with a sympathetic shake of the head. I told Mom it was not true and that my record was clear. She said she believed me, but her voice carried the shadow of doubt that rumors leave even when they are denied. That weekend, I stopped by a small boutique downtown to pick up a birthday gift for a client. On my way out, I ran into Emily Sanders, one of Rachel's newer hires at her spa. She was carrying a stack of supply boxes and waved me over. We chatted for a moment and she asked about my work. Then, almost as if she forgot herself, she said, Rachel sometimes told clients she worried about me, that I was under too much pressure and not handling it well. Emily's face went pale the moment the words left her mouth. She apologized, said she should not have repeated it, and hurried back inside. I walked to my car, feeling like the air had turned heavier. Rachel was not just talking to family, she was weaving the same narrative into her business conversations. That meant it would travel further into circles that might include potential clients for me. 2 days later, I got a text from my father inviting me to a small gathering at their house in Greenville. He said it would be just close family, a chance to catch up without all the noise of the holidays. I knew better than to think it was without an agenda, but I went. When I arrived, Rachel and Daniel were already there, seated on the couch across from my parents. Rachel's expression was polite but cool, the kind she wore when she was about to perform civility. Daniel sat back with one arm stretched across the couch, his other hand tapping a slow rhythm on his knee. We started with coffee and cookies, light talk about the weather and the city's plans to expand the parkway. Then Rachel shifted the conversation. She said she had been worried about me, that she had heard from several people that I seemed distracted and maybe overwhelmed. She looked around the room as if gathering silent agreement. I told her plainly that I was fine and that my work was steady. My father cleared his throat and said it was good to hear, but Rachel pressed on, asking if I was sure, if maybe I had taken on more than I could manage. I could feel the heat rising in my face. I asked her why she felt the need to share her so-called concerns with our aunts, uncles, and even people she barely knew. She tilted her head and said she only wanted to help, that sometimes people needed someone to notice before they burned out. Daniel chose that moment to lean forward, his voice dropping into a tone meant to cut through the air. He said I was stirring up trouble, turning a simple conversation into an attack. He called me a divider, someone who thrived on creating rifts. The room seemed to contract. My mother shifted in her chair, my father looked at his hands. I could feel the weight of Daniel's presence pressing against the moment, making it clear that pushing back further would only escalate things in a way that would turn everyone against me. I took a slow breath and sat back, my hands folded in my lap. Daniel leaned away satisfied, and Rachel offered a thin smile as if she had been vindicated. The conversation moved on to my cousin's new job, my father's latest fishing trip, the price of gas. I answered questions when addressed, but kept my tone, even refusing to give them the spark they wanted. When it was time to leave, I hugged my parents and nodded a polite goodbye to Rachel and Daniel. On the drive home, the low hum of the tires on the highway gave me space to think. Rachel's game was always the same: undermine quietly, then step back and let others draw the conclusions she wanted them to draw. Daniel's role was to shut down resistance with intimidation. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and pulled up my project files, reviewing timelines and client feedback. I thought about printing them out, carrying proof in case the rumors found their way to someone whose opinion mattered to my work, but I knew better. Showing proof too early could look defensive, and Rachel thrived on making me look reactionary. The next morning, at the coffee shop near my office, I ran into Aunt Marlene. She asked if I was doing better. When I said I was fine, she nodded, but her eyes searched mine for cracks. I smiled, kept it brief, and left with my latte. That afternoon, I got a text from Lily asking if I could help her with a school project on Saturday. She said it was for social studies and that she needed to interview someone about fairness. I agreed immediately. The thought of spending time with her was a relief, a place where I did not have to defend myself from whispered campaigns. Still, the meeting at my parents' house replayed in my mind over the next few days. Daniel's voice calling me a divider lingered, not because I believed it but because I recognized the strategy. If they could label me as the problem, anything I said afterward could be dismissed as part of the problem itself. On Friday evening, I got a call from my father, brief and strained. He said he hoped we could all get along for Mom's birthday dinner next week. I told him I would be there. When we hung up, I stared out the window at the streetlights blinking on one by one, and I knew the line between keeping the peace and letting them rewrite reality was getting thinner. Saturday came, and with it the sharp, clear air of early spring. I drove to Rachel's house to pick up Lily. She came out with her backpack and a notebook, her face bright but her eyes carrying that same deep watchfulness I had noticed before. As we drove toward the library, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just a little. Here at least was one person who saw more than she said. By the time I dropped her off that afternoon, I had made up my mind. I would not confront Rachel again in a room Daniel could control. If the truth came out, it would not be through another shouting match. It would come when they least expected it, and it would not be my voice that delivered the final blow. The following Monday, I drove to my parents' house in Greenville, telling myself it was just for coffee, just to see my mother without an audience. The azaleas along the driveway were just starting to bloom a soft pink that should have felt comforting but instead reminded me of how often appearances here disguised something brittle underneath. Mom was in the kitchen when I came in, her sleeves rolled to the elbow as she rinsed strawberries in a colander. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and asked if I wanted tea. I said yes and sat at the table, the one we had eaten at every Sunday when Rachel and I were kids. I started with small talk, asking about her garden and if she had seen the new bakery on Main Street. She nodded, answered, but her movements had a slight tension as though she was bracing for something. When I finally said I wanted to talk about Rachel, she set the colander down and wiped her hands on a towel. I told her about the rumors, how Rachel had been telling people I was struggling at work, how Daniel had called me a divider in front of the family. I kept my voice even, but I didn't hide the hurt. I said I needed to know she believed me, that she understood what was happening. She sat down across from me and folded her hands. For a moment I thought I saw the mother who used to defend me when teachers misunderstood, who once drove across town in a rainstorm to bring me the sneakers I forgot for a game. But then she sighed, her gaze dropping to the table. "Claire," she said, "you know I love you. But Rachel has her own pressures. She's told me she feels you're too critical of her marriage, that you don't respect Daniel." I felt the air go colder. I told her respecting someone didn't mean ignoring when they humiliate you. I reminded her of the dinner at Thanksgiving, the tone Rachel used, the look Daniel gave me when he stepped in close. She looked at me then, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She reached out as if to take my hand, then pulled back. "Rachel made it clear," she said quietly, "that if I take sides, she won't bring Lily around anymore. She said Lily doesn't need to hear family disagreements." I leaned back in my chair, the truth settling over me. My mother was afraid of losing access to her granddaughter, and Rachel knew it. I asked her if she thought it was right to let Rachel use Lily as leverage. She didn't answer, only reached for the tea kettle and poured hot water into my cup. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock above the sink. I realized then that she wasn't going to give me what I came for. The loyalty I wanted from her was tangled up in fear, and Rachel had made sure of it. I stood and said I should get back to Charlotte before traffic thickened. She walked me to the door, gave me a quick hug, and told me to be careful driving. Her voice was warm, but her eyes still carried that guarded distance. As I stepped onto the porch, I caught a glimpse of her watching me through the glass, her face unreadable. I didn't know then that after I pulled away, she would pick up the phone and call my Uncle Thomas. But I did know something had shifted between us, that a part of me had stopped expecting her to step in. The drive back felt longer than usual. I kept replaying the conversation, wondering if there was something I could have said differently, something that might have cracked through the hesitation in her voice. But the truth was, Rachel's hold on her had been built over years. It wasn't going to break with one conversation. When I reached my apartment, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the blinds, casting long stripes across the floor. I made tea I didn't really want and sat on the couch, trying to quiet the restless hum in my chest. Somewhere between sips, I remembered Lily's careful questions, the way she watched and listened. That thought was both a comfort and a worry. Later that night, I called Dad to check in. He answered on the second ring, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone to overhear. We talked about the weather, his plans to fix the shed, but not about Rachel. I could feel the same caution in him, the same unwillingness to say something that might get back to her. After we hung up, I walked to the window and looked out over the quiet street. A couple was walking their dog, the sound of its tags jingling faintly in the air. Everything looked ordinary, but the undercurrent in my family was anything but. I thought about calling a friend, unloading the whole story, but stopped. For now, I would keep my own counsel. There was a time to speak and a time to watch, and right now watching felt like the safer choice. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed a missed call from Mom. No message. I set the phone down, deciding I would call back later. What I didn't know was that the call had come minutes after she spoke to Thomas, her voice tight as she told him she was worried about both me and Lily, that Rachel and Daniel's house didn't feel safe anymore. For now, all I had was the image of her standing in the kitchen, hands folded, words held back, and the uneasy sense that something was moving beneath the surface, just out of my sight. It was 3 days later, a gray Thursday afternoon, when Lily asked if I could pick her up from school instead of Rachel. She said her mom had a hair appointment that ran late and Dad was out showing a house to a client. I agreed without thinking too much of it, but when she climbed into the passenger seat, her backpack wedged against her chest like she was guarding something, I felt a flicker of curiosity. She didn't say much until we pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop halfway between her school and my apartment. She asked if we could go in, and once we had drinks, she slid into a booth near the back. I asked her how her day was, expecting the usual answers about math tests or lunchroom drama. Instead, she leaned forward and said she had something to tell me, but I couldn't repeat it to anyone. I told her she could trust me, and she took a deep breath. "I've been recording some things at home," she said quietly. "Videos." I blinked, unsure how to respond. She explained that she had started using an old phone she kept in her room to record when her parents argued, especially when Daniel's voice got loud. She said she hid it in different places, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes on the bookshelf in the living room. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I asked her why she was doing this, and she shrugged in that small, deliberate way kids use when they know the truth might upset you. "I want proof," she said. "Proof that Mom's not lying when she says Dad gets scary. Proof that he's mean to you too." I told her it wasn't safe, that if Daniel found out he might take her phone or worse. She met my gaze, her eyes steady. "I've already saved them in different places," she said. "On the cloud, on a flash drive I hid at school, and on Grandma's old computer when we visited last weekend." She reached into her backpack and pulled out the phone. I hesitated, then took it. The screen was smudged from her fingers, and she tapped on a folder labeled Home. The first clip she opened was only 30 seconds long, but it felt much longer. Daniel's voice filled the tiny speaker, sharp and loud, telling Rachel she was useless, that she couldn't keep a house clean if her life depended on it. I could hear Rachel try to answer, her tones strained before the sound of glass shattering cut through. Lily's eyes were on me as I watched. "That's when he threw a coffee mug at the wall," she said. It didn't hit her, but it scared her so bad she stopped talking. I looked down at the phone, my pulse heavy in my ears. This wasn't just shouting, this was the kind of escalation that could end in something worse. I handed the phone back, my hands tighter than they needed to be. She told me there were more, some from nights I hadn't been there. One where Daniel slammed the door so hard a picture frame fell, another where he told Rachel she'd regret making him look bad in front of me. I wanted to tell her to delete them all, to pretend none of it existed. But I also knew what those clips could mean if things got worse. We sat there for a long moment, the hum of the coffee shop around us feeling almost surreal compared to what I'd just seen. She asked if I was mad at her for doing it, and I said no, but that she had to be careful, more careful than she'd ever been. She nodded like she had already planned for that. When I dropped her off later, she gave me a quick hug before getting out. As she walked up the driveway, Daniel's car turned onto the street. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I watched him pull into the garage. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. Driving away, I kept replaying the sound of that mug hitting the wall. It was the kind of sound that stayed with you, the kind that made you check over your shoulder without realizing it. Lily wasn't just seeing too much. She was documenting it piece by piece, and in doing so she had stepped into a dangerous role. Back at my apartment, I sat on the couch and tried to focus on my laptop, but my mind kept drifting back to her small hands holding that phone, her calm voice as she explained her backup plans. She was 9 years old, and already she understood that truth didn't always speak for itself. Sometimes you had to catch it in the act. I thought about calling Mom to tell her, but stopped. If she knew, she might panic and say something to Rachel, and then the whole thing would unravel. For now, the safest place for this knowledge was between Lily and me. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something had shifted. The sense of movement beneath the surface that I'd felt for days was no longer vague. It had a shape now, a dangerous, fragile shape built out of digital files and the will of a child who refused to look away. And whether I liked it or not, I was part of it. 2 days later, Thomas showed up at my door in Greenville without warning, a travel mug in one hand and the other tucked into the pocket of his jacket. He looked like he had driven straight from work, his tie loosened, his expression set in that calm, deliberate way he got when something was already decided in his mind. I let him in, and before I could even offer coffee, he said he wanted me to tell him everything. We sat at my kitchen table while the late winter light shifted across the floor. I started from Thanksgiving and worked forward, telling him about Rachel's digs at me, Daniel's temper, the inheritance lies, and finally Lily's recordings. I could see his jaw tighten when I mentioned the coffee mug hitting the wall, and by the time I finished, his hands were flat on the table, fingers spread as if steadying himself. He asked to see the videos. I hesitated, but when I handed over my phone, I knew it wasn't just curiosity. He watched them without speaking, rewinding one clip to catch a detail in Daniel's tone. When he set the phone down, his voice was low but certain. "We are not ignoring this." Thomas pulled out his own phone and called someone named Brian Cooper, introducing him as a friend and attorney in Charlotte who had handled protective orders before. He stepped into the living room for privacy, but I could hear enough to know he was outlining the situation in broad strokes. When he came back, he told me Brian could meet with us the next afternoon to explain our options for a protective order and how to approach Child Protective Services without putting Lily in danger. The certainty in his tone made my chest tighten with something between relief and fear. I asked him if he understood how far Rachel and Daniel might go if they thought we were pulling in outside help. His mouth curved in a humorless smile. "That's exactly why we are doing it through the system. If they want to push back, they will have to do it in daylight." It was almost evening when he left, promising to pick me up the next day for the meeting. I was rinsing dishes when my phone rang. The caller ID made my stomach drop. "Daniel." I answered, and his voice came through sharp and clipped. "I hear Thomas has been making calls. You think bringing in some lawyer is going to make you a hero? This is family business, Claire. You drag outsiders into it, you're going to regret it." I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, but my voice was too rehearsed. He laughed, a short, cold sound. "Don't test me. Stay out of my house and stay away from my kid." Then the line went dead. I stood there with the phone still in my hand, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud in the silence. My first instinct was to call Thomas and tell him everything, but I knew if I did, he would drive back over and we'd be one step closer to a confrontation we weren't ready for. Instead, I sat on the couch staring at the dark screen of my phone until my pulse slowed enough to think clearly. The next afternoon, Thomas picked me up and drove us to Brian's office in a brick building near the courthouse. Brian was in his 40s with a steady, unhurried way of speaking that made it easier to breathe. He laid out what we would need for a protective order, what kind of incidents counted, and how CPS could be brought in without tipping off Daniel before they were ready. When I mentioned Lily's recordings, his eyes sharpened. "That's evidence," he said. "And if she handed it to the right person, it would be very hard to ignore." We talked for over an hour planning next steps. The legal language felt cold compared to the heat of what was happening, but it was the kind of cold that carried weight. By the time we left, I knew we were walking into something bigger than I had let myself imagine, but I also knew it was the only path forward that didn't end with someone getting hurt in the shadows. In the parking lot, Thomas put a hand on my shoulder. "We do this smart, we do it right, and we don't stop until she's safe." I nodded, my throat tight. The wind cut across the lot sharp with the scent of rain, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest shift of balance in my favor. Thomas called the next morning, his tone leaving no room for delay. He wanted to see Lily somewhere away from the house, somewhere they could talk without Daniel or Rachel overhearing. We agreed to meet at the small community park near my place in Greenville, the one with the faded blue slides and the wooden benches tucked under the maple trees. The air was cold enough to turn breath into clouds, and the ground was still soft from last night's rain. I spotted Lily before she saw me, her sneakers kicking up bits of damp mulch as she ran from the swings. Her hair was loose today, curling slightly from the humidity, and her cheeks were flushed from the chill. She launched herself into my arms with the kind of hug that made my ribs ache, then looked up at Thomas with a shy but certain smile. He crouched to her level right there on the path, his coat brushing the ground. He told her he had seen some of the videos she had shared with me and wanted to make sure she understood what it meant to keep going. His voice was gentle but firm, the way you speak to someone who is both a child and somehow older than her years. He explained that gathering proof could be dangerous if people found out, but it could also be the thing that made adults finally listen. Lily glanced at me, then back to Thomas. Her voice wavered for only a second before it steadied. She said she didn't want her mom to keep thinking it was okay to let people hurt family, that she wanted me safe and she wanted her mom safe too. She added almost in a whisper that she knew something that could make people believe her without question. We moved to a bench away from the playground where the sound of kids laughing couldn't quite reach us. Lily took her phone from her jacket pocket, holding it like it was something fragile and dangerous at the same time. She told us about the video she hadn't shown anyone yet. It had happened right before Thanksgiving. Rachel had been in the kitchen making coffee, talking about me in that high mocking tone she used when she thought no one important was listening. Daniel was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. Lily said she was in the hallway pretending to play a game on her tablet, but her camera was recording. When Rachel made another cutting remark about how I couldn't keep a job, Daniel looked up sharply. He muttered something she couldn't catch, and Rachel shot back with something sharper. Without warning, his hand came across her face. The sound, Lily said, was like dropping a book on a tile floor, loud, abrupt, final. Rachel staggered, caught herself on the counter, and didn't say another word. Lily's hands trembled as she opened the video. From her hidden spot, the shot caught the reflection in the microwave door. It was enough. We could see the movement, hear the impact, and watch Rachel flinch. The air in my lungs felt heavy. I had imagined Daniel's temper plenty of times, but watching it connect like that made my stomach turn. She told us she had already backed the video up in 3 different places, one on her tablet, one on a flash drive hidden in her backpack, and one in a cloud account with a password no one else knew. Her eyes met mine then, and there was no trace of hesitation. Thomas told her she was brave, but reminded her that this wasn't just about collecting evidence anymore. It was about using it to stop what was happening. He asked if she was ready for certain adults to see it, people who could make changes. Lily nodded without blinking. We walked back toward my house in silence, the crunch of gravel under our feet the only sound. Inside, I made hot chocolate for Lily while Thomas stepped into the living room to call our father. He didn't send the video, not yet, but he told Dad there was something he needed to see in person. I could hear the heaviness in Dad's voice even from across the room. The pause after Thomas said it involved Rachel and Daniel. That evening Dad came by. We sat in my kitchen, the three of us, and Thomas finally showed him the clip. Dad didn't speak for a long moment after it ended. His hands stayed on the table, fingers pressed flat, and when he finally looked at us, his eyes were darker than I'd ever seen. He said he would make some calls in the morning. Lily didn't wait. That night she sent the video to the CPS contact. Her school counselor had given her, attaching a short note that simply read, "This is real." She pressed send, set the phone down, and went back to sipping her drink as if she hadn't just dropped a stone into the still water of our family. I walked her out to Thomas's car a little later. The street was quiet, just the distant hum of a car somewhere down the block. She climbed into the back seat, buckled up, and gave me a small wave through the glass. As they drove away, the cold air bit at my skin, and for the first time in a long while I felt that something solid was finally in our corner, ready to shift the weight that had been pressing down for years. Thanksgiving morning broke cold and gray, the kind of weather that made the air taste metallic. I drove to Rachel and Daniel's house in Charlotte with a pie balanced on the passenger seat, the radio low, and my mind already rehearsing ways to sidestep her barbs. The driveway was packed, cars angled up along the curb, the front door propped open to the sound of voices and the smell of roasting turkey. Inside, the dining room table had been extended with the extra leaf, a white tablecloth falling in neat lines to the floor. Rachel was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up over a cream sweater, arranging sweet potatoes in a dish with the kind of precision she saved for company. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her gaze flicking over my outfit like she was measuring me against some invisible chart. By the time we all sat down, the air was already tight. Conversation flowed easily enough at first, mostly about football scores and the weather, but it took Rachel less than 10 minutes to find her opening. She leaned back in her chair, fork hovering above her plate, and told Daniel's mother how some people just never manage to find the right career fit. Daniel chuckled, glancing in my direction, and added something about how not everyone was cut out for high-pressure work. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting small bites of turkey, letting the words pass over me. But each time I thought the topic might shift, Rachel steered it back, sliding in little comments about stability, responsibility, and how grateful she was to be surrounded by people who pulled their own weight. Daniel backed her every time, his voice low but carrying, while his father nodded along as though it was all common sense. Across the table, Lily was quiet, pushing peas around her plate. She glanced at me once, her expression unreadable, then went back to her food. The hum of forks and quiet laughter from the far end of the table felt like background noise to the sharper rhythm of Rachel's remarks. At one point, she leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked me directly if my situation at work had cleared up. The room went still for a beat, all eyes turning to me, waiting. I simply said my work was fine and left it at that. Rachel's lips curved into a smile that was almost satisfied, as if my brevity confirmed something for her. The tension stretched thin as we moved through the meal. Daniel's uncle tried to lighten it with a story about his fishing trip, but Rachel cut in with another pointed remark about how some people could learn from the discipline of early mornings and hard work. I caught Thomas's eyes from across the table. He didn't say anything, but the set of his jaw told me he was counting the minutes until this was over. It happened after dessert plates had been set down, when the conversation had settled into that sluggish post-meal lull. Lily pushed her chair back, the legs scraping softly against the wood floor. She stood, her hands resting lightly on the table's edge, her gaze moving from one adult to the next. Her voice was steady when she said she had something to share. Every head turned toward her. She told them she had been recording things at home, that she had proof of how her parents spoke to each other and to me. She said she had already sent the videos to her grandfather and to people whose job it was to keep kids safe. Then she added without a pause that they were on their way here. For a moment, the room was suspended in silence. Daniel's fork slipped from his hand and hit the plate with a dull clang. Rachel's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide whether to deny or demand. Daniel's mother leaned back in her chair, blinking as if she hadn't understood. Lily didn't flinch. She straightened her shoulders and said it again, slower this time, that help was coming and that no one here could stop it. I could feel the air shift heavy and charged, as though the walls themselves had heard her and were bracing for what would come next. A sudden knock rattled the front door sharp and deliberate, carrying through the tense silence like the crack of a whip. Every head turned in unison, eyes darting toward the entryway. Chairs scraped softly against the hardwood as people shifted, no one certain who should move first. Rachel's brow furrowed, her lips parting as if to speak, but before she could take a step, Thomas's voice rang out from the foyer. The front door swung wide, and Thomas stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. Behind him, Officer David Lee entered in full uniform, the silver badge catching the light from the chandelier overhead. His expression was calm but firm, the kind that told you he had walked into plenty of rooms like this before. Brian Cooper followed, his navy suit perfectly pressed, leather briefcase in hand, his eyes sweeping over the scene like he was cataloging every face. Rachel froze halfway out of her chair, confusion giving way to recognition. Her gaze flicked from Thomas to David and then to Brian, and her color drained just enough for me to notice. Daniel, seated at the head of the table, leaned back slightly, arms folding across his chest in a defensive, territorial posture. David took 2 measured steps forward, a folded set of papers in his hand. He glanced around the table before speaking in a voice steady enough to cut through every whispered breath. He announced that a temporary protective order had been granted for both Lily and me, effective immediately. The terms were unambiguous. Daniel was to vacate the premises at once and have no direct or indirect contact until the scheduled hearing. The words landed like stones on glass. A ripple of shock passed around the table. Rachel's jaw dropped, her eyes darting toward Daniel in disbelief. He sat motionless for a beat too long, as though trying to process what he had just heard. Then, without warning, his chair screeched backward, legs scraping hard against the floor as he shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice booming against the walls. "This is a family matter. You have no right to." He didn't get to finish. Kevin Ross, who had been quietly seated 2 places down, rose with a controlled swiftness and stepped between Daniel and the officer. Kevin's hand came up, palm open, in a silent order to stand down. His voice, when it came, was low but cut with steel. "You're making this worse. Stop now." Daniel's breathing was heavy, the muscles in his jaw tightening with the effort to hold back. His eyes shifted toward Kevin, then back to David, then to Rachel, as though searching for a lifeline. But Rachel looked too stunned to give him one. Brian Cooper moved toward the buffet table and placed his briefcase down with precision. He opened it, withdrew a file, and began explaining the process in clipped, unshakable terms. Any violation of the order, he said, would result in immediate arrest. His tone left no space for argument. Rachel found her voice then, though it trembled at the edges. "This is a mistake. You're letting her," she gestured sharply toward me, "twist everything. She's been poisoning this family for months." Before she could gather more momentum, a quiet clink interrupted her. Olivia Ross, seated near the far end of the table, had set her wineglass down. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and cool. "I've heard enough in this house over the years to know Claire's not making this up," Olivia said. Her voice was even, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "I've seen things. I've heard them. And Lily's braver than all of us for speaking up." The room seemed to contract around her words. Rachel's head turned slowly toward her mother-in-law, shock etched into every line of her face. Kevin didn't move, his stance between Daniel and the officer as firm as before. Daniel's shoulders dropped a fraction, the fight in him dimming under the combined pressure. David stepped closer to Daniel, extending the protective order for him to acknowledge. The paper trembled slightly in Daniel's hand as he signed. The scratch of the pen was loud in the silence. "You have 10 minutes to collect what you need," David said. "After that, you need to be outside." Daniel muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch, his voice thick with resentment. He left the dining room without looking at me, Rachel trailing after him like she was tethered to his anger. I could hear them in the hall, their voices low but sharp, fragments of sentences carried back to the table by the stillness of the house. Thomas moved to stand just behind Lily's chair, one hand resting lightly on the back of it. His eyes followed every movement in the hallway, his posture calm but alert. I stayed seated, my palms pressed flat against the cool surface of the table, feeling the strange quiet of a storm that had finally broken. When Daniel returned, his coat was slung over one arm, a duffel bag in the other. He didn't speak to anyone. David followed him to the door, holding it open while Daniel stepped out into the cold night. Rachel lingered in the doorway, her expression caught between fury and disbelief before finally closing it behind her husband. Olivia picked up her glass again, took a measured sip, and set it down with care. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose we can finish dinner now." No one moved right away. The balance of the evening had shifted so suddenly it felt as if the house itself was adjusting to the new weight. I stayed very still, the image of Lily sitting so upright beside me fixed in my mind. For the first time in years, the truth had not been pushed aside. It was standing in the middle of the room, visible to everyone, and no one could pretend it wasn't there. In the days that followed, the house felt different, quieter in a way that wasn't just about sound. Rachel avoided my calls and Daniel stayed gone, his presence reduced to a few lingering items in the garage that Officer Lee later oversaw him collecting. Within a week, the temporary order had turned into something far more serious. The investigation moved quickly once the videos were in the hands of CPS and the prosecutor's office. Daniel was arrested on charges of domestic violence, intimidation, and child endangerment. Watching him led away in handcuffs during his arraignment brought no joy, only a deep, steady sense of relief that someone else would finally hold him accountable. Rachel's face in the courtroom was pale and tight, her eyes darting toward me only once. She did not speak to Lily, though. I saw the way her hands trembled when the judge announced she would lose temporary custody for at least a year and be required to attend counseling sessions focused on abuse dynamics. Lily was placed with me under the supervision of Thomas and Mom, and for the first time the child who had been carrying so much looked like she could breathe again. Life in Greenville took on a new rhythm. Thomas's house had space enough for all of us, and Margaret slipped easily into the role of morning coffee companion and quiet encourager. I returned to work, though I eased in slowly, taking afternoons to pick Lily up from school and be present in ways she had not experienced in years. Her grades began to climb, and she started drawing again, her sketchpad filling with scenes that were lighter, freer. The ripples reached Rachel quickly. Word spread in her neighborhood and among her spa's clientele. Appointments were canceled and regulars stopped showing up. Without Daniel's income and with her own business faltering, she sold the second car and downsized to a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Her in-laws, led by Olivia's quiet influence, stopped inviting her to family gatherings. Kevin made it clear that until she took responsibility for her role, the door would remain closed. Our parents, shaken by how far things had gone, called a family meeting in Greenville one Sunday. They looked older, the weight of decisions long deferred now pressing visibly on their shoulders. Dad admitted they had let Rachel's influence steer too many choices, including financial ones. The inheritance plan, once skewed to her advantage, was redrawn with equal shares for me and Thomas. It was less about the money and more about the signal it sent. Her control was broken. Rachel did not attend that meeting. Later I heard she had tried to argue with Dad on the phone, her voice sharp enough to carry through the receiver. He ended the call without raising his voice, just repeating that things had changed and would stay that way. Months passed and the edges of our lives softened. Winter gave way to spring and Lily ran track for her middle school, her hair streaming behind her in the afternoon sun. Daniel's sentencing came that April, 18 months in county jail and 3 years of probation with a mandatory completion of anger management and substance counseling. I sat in the back of the courtroom watching the man who had once loomed so large shrink into the reality of his choices. Rachel's court-mandated therapy continued. Lily met her mother occasionally in supervised settings, the visits structured and short. Each time Lily came back quiet, reflective, but not shaken. She told me once that she hoped her mom would change, but she was not holding her breath. I told her it was okay to hope and okay to protect herself at the same time. On a warm evening in June, we had dinner outside at Thomas's, the table set under strings of white lights. Margaret brought out lemon pie, and Lily told a story about her science teacher that made us all laugh. I sat back in my chair, the sound of her laughter wrapping around me, and realized that somewhere along the way, the constant tension in my shoulders had eased. The battles had been public and raw, the fallout messy and painful, but they had also cleared a path. I had not just defended myself, I had helped carve out safety for someone who needed it more. That truth settled deep, a quiet anchor in the center of my chest. If you have ever seen someone you love stand up against something that tried to crush them, you know the mix of fear and pride it stirs. And if you have been that person, you know the cost and the strength it leaves behind. Share your story or stand beside someone living theirs, because every voice matters when it comes to protecting those who cannot yet protect themselves.